What's up, everybody? Hope you're having a great day. Today, we're going to cover Chapter 1, Lab. So let's go ahead and jump into this. For lab this semester, you are going to need your lab manual for anatomy and physiology, and this is just a loose leaf. It's a 3-hole punch set of papers, and whenever you open up that package, then you will see that there are all kinds of terms listed with some blanks out beside it for you to take notes in. And so this is how we're going to take lab this semester. We're going to use this lab manual, and we're also going to use our collection of anatomy images, the Anatomy Atlas. And so I like to refer to that as the images book many times. And so we're going to use the images book many times to find the parts that are listed on the lab book in the lab manual itself. So there are 2 separate books. There's more of a word book and more of a picture book. So I'm from Pickens, so I like to simplify things. So if I talk about the word book, then I'm talking about the lab manual that mainly has the words where you can take notes beside them. And then if I'm talking about the picture book, I'm talking about the Anatomy Atlas, the collection of images. So first off, in your lab manual, we're going to notice that there are many different things listed, but most of this starts out for this first lab. It's referred to as the general body plan, and there are several things here in my lab manual, but my lab manual is missing some of these things. So I definitely want you to make a note about that as we go, in case your manual is like mine. I do have an older one, but a lot of this beginning stuff is not in there. My manual only has a lot of the basic body structures, and then it has some information about body cavities and cavity linings. But I want you to be aware that we also need to know a little bit about each of the systems, and we also need to know about superficial anatomy terms, and we need to know about directional terms, and we need to know about planes and sections. And so we're going to cover all that today here in this lab, and it shouldn't take us too crazy long to get through this, hopefully less than 45 minutes. So let's go ahead and let's begin. First off, and as we go through, by the way, I am to point out how you can prepare for the lab tests. The lab tests are fill in the blank, and so your spelling is important. I do judge everybody's spelling. I get to go back and take a look at everybody's spelling and see if it's close enough, or I'm a little more lenient towards the beginning of this semester, and I'll get a little bit more difficult, harder on grading once we get towards the end of the semester. But get prepared for that. So be prepared, and I will give you examples of questions that will be asked on the test as we go through each of these individual sections, and kind of give you a little bit of heads up about what to expect, so there's a little bit less anxiety. Most students, if you have an expectation, you know what you're supposed to do, then they tend to be able to achieve it, and they tend to be able to do a good job. So I want to make sure that you're prepared and understand what to expect before you even get on the test. All right, so as we go, I'll mention that. First off, let's just mention that we do have 11 body systems in our body, 11 organ systems, and of course we mentioned this last time with the review. If you haven't watched the review, you should watch the review. It deals with the different levels of organization. So an organism is built out of organ systems, and an organ system is made out of organs, and again, organs are made out of tissues, which are made out of cells. And so when we're looking at these organ systems, what we're really looking at are all of the different components that create that homeostasis that keep the human body alive. So we are a multicellular organism, and we require these organ systems to perform our activities. So let's just get into them and talk about them. And if you want to follow along in your textbook, you can always look in Chapter 1, and there's some images that I will get to that show you all these different organ systems. So I would like for you to be familiar with each organ system, some basic functions of what they do, and kind of what they are for this test. Okay, so first off, the integumentary system is our first system. We see that listed towards the bottom of this page, Integumentary System. This is basically your skin. So people may have never heard that term, but this is one of the first systems that we cover in Bio 210 because it's a very basic system. It's very simple and it's easy to understand. So the integumentary system is your skin. It provides protection for your body, helps to regulate your body temperature. It says it houses receptors. So it has to do with sensory. It helps us to sense our environment like touch. It helps to change vitamin D3 into a chemical that can help us to absorb calcium in our body. It's really silly. You hear some people say, oh, I went outside and I got some vitamin D today, hanging out in the sun. You didn't get vitamin D from the sun. You have to eat any vitamin that you get, and that's the reason they're referred to as vitamins. You have to eat them, and then once you eat them, then the sun helps to change that vitamin D3 into something different. So you're not getting vitamin D3 from the sun. What you're getting is the sun is causing reactions with vitamin D3 to eventually make a chemical that helps calcium go into your intestines so that we can get it into our body. We're going to find out calcium is super important for so many different metabolic processes. One of the most important things besides providing protection is it prevents water loss. It prevents dehydration. If we didn't have skin, we would dehydrate in 15 minutes or so. So it wouldn't take us long to just dehydrate to death. The next system that we're going to cover is the skeletal system. Skeletal system is made up of the bones and the cartilage and the joints. It provides support and protection inside of the bones where the bone marrow is located. In our red bone marrow, then it is very important for process called hemopoiesis, which is blood cell production. And so this is where our red blood cells are made, and most of our white blood cells are made here as well, and our platelets are made here. And so very important component of the skeletal system a lot of people don't think about. It is a living system, right? So it's not just dead bone, it's living bone, and inside of this bone is this marrow cavity where we've got a lot of activity, a lot of synthesis of new cells. Also, the bone itself is important to store calcium and phosphorus. 99% of our calcium and 88% or so of our phosphorus is stored in our bones at any one point in time. Both of these, again, very important for metabolism. Muscular system is next. Obviously, this is going to include our muscles and many of our ligaments and tendons even we might throw into that group. And so this is important to produce movement, right? It contracts and it produces movement. We kind of mentioned that with the review talking about the type of tissue, muscle tissue. But it also generates heat. How do we get 98.6? Do we have a furnace inside of us? No, it's our muscles that generate much of that heat. Anytime we change energy forms, ATP, into movement, we're going to lose a lot of that energy, and we lose it in the form of heat. And so this is really what stokes our fire and gets our body temperature up. Nervous system. Nervous system is one of the two main control systems. And this is as far as we're going to get this semester in Bio 210. The nervous system is a very complicated system. It's really kind of the most complicated out of all the systems. So we're going to spend almost half of our semester talking about the nervous system. First half, skin, skeleton, muscles, and then we're going to hit that nervous system hot and heavy. And so nervous system, along with the endocrine system, are the two main control systems of the body. The nervous system tends to do more fast-acting control. It tends to be more survival kind of instinctual kind of things. And so it does control our body movement voluntarily. It's responsible for consciousness and intelligence and memory. It's also unconsciously, it controls our body too. Whenever we fall asleep, we don't stop breathing, our heart doesn't stop pumping. And again, this is our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system, keeping us alive. Again, the endocrine system is the second component of our control system, along with that nervous system. Instead of using neurotransmitters like the nervous system does and passing them in between cells very quickly, the endocrine system uses hormones. And so what hormones are they're very similar to neurotransmitters, but instead of going in a synapse and in between these two very specific types of cells, these hormones enter the bloodstream, they travel around the body, and anywhere there's a receptor in the body on any cell or any tissue, then that hormone is going to bind, and it's going to cause some change in its metabolism, in that cell or that tissue's metabolism. So it's going to change what that area is doing. So again, it's a way to control the body, and we'll talk about this. This is the beginning of Bio 211, and so here are the systems we're going to focus on for Bio 211. And after the endocrine system, again, connecting connecting blood with these hormones, we're going to talk about cardiovascular system. Cardiovascular system includes heart and the blood vessels and the blood it contains. And so we're going to have 3 chapters dealing with that. When we get to 211, again, blood is a transport fluid. So we mentioned that real quick in the review if you listened all the way kind of to the tissue stuff. And so blood is a transport fluid. So its main job is to transport things. Our cardiovascular system moves blood through the vessels to distribute, to move nutrients, gases, hormones, waste, anything good or bad that needs to be transported within our body. It's basically done through that cardiovascular system. This is our superhighway system inside of our body. The lymphatic system is actually an extra drainage system. And so what the lymph is it's actually fluid that becomes trapped in your tissues. When we exchange at capillaries over here in the cardiovascular system, some of the fluid that we push into the tissues and into the cells to keep them alive and give them their nutrients doesn't come back into the bloodstream whenever we get all that waste back out. And so again, at a capillary, we're going to exchange and give the tissues the good and take away their bad. Some of the fluid that we push in does not come out. That fluid must be drained somewhere else. So we have another drainage system called the lymph system. And once that fluid enters that system, that's when we call it lymph. So the job of the lymphatic system is primarily to transport that lymph away from the tissues. If it doesn't, then the body's going to start to become edemic. Edema is where fluid accumulates in the tissues. If you've ever been around a lady who is pregnant and seen her feet, at least my wife when she was pregnant, her feet were like memory foam mattresses. She had so much edema in her feet, because it wouldn't kind of flow back out. So she claimed that the doctor told her that I needed to rub her feet every single day, and that was part of a prescription. Not really. I just love my wife. And so every single day she wanted me to rub her feet to help get all that lymph out, and that kind of helps you to feel better in the long run. Now, when that lymph is flowing back to the cardiovascular system, because we're going to regain this extra fluid, send it back to the CVS, it's going to trigger immunity. And so a lot of times whenever you hear about the lymphatic system, you connect it to the immune system. And the reason why is because lymph is carrying whatever is in the tissue, be it good or bad. And if it's bad, it can trigger an immune response. And we can kind of start that immune kind of reaction taking place. The next system is the respiratory system. The respiratory system is important for gas exchange outside of the body to inside the body and into the blood, but it's also important to get it to inside each cell. The true meaning of respiration deals with inside of the cell. When the cell uses sugar and oxygen in the mitochondria to make ATP, that's called cell respiration. So the true meaning of the system is to provide the gases and take away the waste gas in order for each cell to make ATP. But in the process, usually we just talk about breathing. We talk about gases entering and leaving the lungs, and then gas exchange into the bloodstream, and then eventually between the cells. But once it gets into the cells, cell respiration is where we're going to make that ATP. And again, this is why oxygen is so important. Why do you stop? Why do you die whenever you don't breathe for 5 minutes? It's because cells don't make ATP. So making ATP really kind of is the meaning of life. Okay, if we're making it, we're alive. The urinary system is the next system. This is a system where we're going to get rid of waste products. So any types of waste products through metabolism is going to be removed through the urinary system. Now, any type of waste that was not digestible, that stays in your digestive tract, well, that's going to be expelled differently. That's going to be expelled as feces. So urine is really anything that was created, any waste that was created through metabolism, through chemistry inside of the body. And so it's not really getting rid of all waste, it's just the metabolic waste. And this tends to be in the bloodstream. So it tends to filter the blood and remove that waste. And we remove it in the form of urine. Again, I mentioned the digestive system. So the digestive system, it takes food materials in, it's going to break them down, and then it's going to absorb the usable nutrients and the vitamins and the good things that we can use. But again, if we cannot break it down and if we cannot absorb it, then we must get rid of it. And so feces, again, is the waste product that's created from all the material you put into your mouth, but your body just could not use. Okay, so there's very rarely any metabolic waste that shows up in the feces. Again, that tends to show up in the urine. And so it's the indigestibles, is what we call it, that end up in the waste product for the digestive system. Last systems is the reproductive systems, the male and the female reproductive systems. Both of these, their goal is to create, number one, the sex hormones, but also to create the gametes, the sex cells. So in the male, the sex cell that is released at ejaculation is called the spermatozoa. So the male reproductive system's function is to create the spermatozoa and also hormones like testosterone. And testosterone's main job is to create spermatozoa. So it kind of cycles back on itself. The female reproductive system, again, is making the oocyte, specifically what's released at ovulation is the secondary oocyte, and also different hormones. And so the hormones that the female tends to make are estrogens and progesterones. And these are at different times in the uterine cycle of each month. And so for the first 2 weeks, one hormone, estrogen, helps to develop the egg. And after the egg is released at the 2-week point at ovulation, then the second 2 weeks is kind of dictated by progesterone, which maintains the uterus in case there's a fetus, an embryo and a fetus that starts to develop. So the female reproductive system is the site of fertilization, and this is where that embryo will grow into a fetus. And the males has the penis in order to transfer the sperm to the female. So a little bit of extra information there, but we'll get into that when we get to 211. Be familiar with these systems. Here are all these systems. Again, you can see integument pointing out the skin. Here's the skeletal looking at bones and cartilage and joints, muscles, muscular system. Here's the nervous system. Then we have the endocrine system. We have the cardiovascular system. We have the lymphatic system and the respiratory system. And finally, we have urinary, digestive, and here's the 2 reproductive systems. So be familiar with these. Obviously, this is our entire next 2 semesters, so that's the reason we took some time to talk about that as well. Now let's move on. Let's talk a little bit more lab-specific information. We're going to use Latin many times, so you're going to see a lot of Latin-based words. And so we're going to use a very precise language to talk about anatomy and physiology. That's the reason spelling is important. And we need to make sure that we are precise as possible. So we are going to use a lot more technical terms than everyday terms. And so you will get more familiar with correct terms instead of just kind of layman's terms, kind of slang terms. Anatomists, first off, let's talk about anatomic position. So anatomy, whenever we're talking about a patient or a subject or anything, especially for example on a test, we're always going to assume that this person is standing in what's called anatomic position. So anatomic position is just kind of our reference point. It's our baseline from where we can kind of discuss where structures are located. So if you're laying face down or face up, well, then structures are located in different places. But if we unify all of this and say, all right, anytime we're asking a question, the question relates to anatomic position, then that makes it easy. So here you can see a list of things. Not too difficult. Upright stance. So the person is standing, feet parallel, flat to the floor. So feet parallel and the toes are facing forward. Upper limbs at the sides of the body, not too difficult, but here's something that a lot of people might get confused. Palms face forward, anteriorly. The palms face forward to put the radius in the ulna and the forearm in a parallel position, to put them side by side instead of having them cross over, which makes it easier to talk about the different areas of the forearm. The head is level and the eyes are looking forward, and so it's really not too tough. Here we've got an image. Here's anatomic position. Make sure you can describe it basically on the test. If I say, what is anatomic position, just give me some of those characteristics. One thing I'm definitely looking for, or a couple things: standing, eyes and toes forward, palms forward. Okay, that's an easy way to remember basically what anatomic position is. Now, I'm not going to talk very much about prone or supine, but you will hear these terms. A prone position is when someone is laying face down, and a supine position is when someone's laying face up. So you may hear that, you may be told to put your patient in a prone position in order to move them or undergo some sort of, rolling them over. And so these are terms that you may hear as you move forward in your healthcare career. Now, here's where we talk real quick about planes and we talk about sections. So we like to divide the body in anatomy, and we like to chop it up so that we can look at it in different views. So these planes and these sections are the ways that we describe these different views. I tend to call them the same thing. A section is a slice or a cut that exposes internal anatomy, and a plane is the imaginary surface passing through the body. I tend to call them the same thing, a plane or a section. But the true term that we should use is a plane for what we're about to talk about. Now, there are three main, and this is a mistake right here. I meant to fix this. There are three main planes. There is the frontal or the coronal plane, and we're about to find out that the frontal or the coronal plane will slice somebody into a front and a back part, an anterior and a posterior portion. A transverse plane is also called a cross section, and this will cut somebody into a top and a bottom part, a superior and inferior portion. Let's drop the mid and let's just call this third one the sagittal plane. Sagittal plane cuts a body into a left and right portion. Now, if we use the term mid-sagittal, then it must cut somebody perfectly down the middle into perfect halves, left and right. So the term sagittal plane is used more often than the word mid-sagittal plane. So the major plane is really the sagittal plane, and a version of sagittal is a mid-sagittal. So let's take a look at these. Okay, here we can see again the coronal plane divides the body into an anterior and a posterior portion, and this is also called a frontal plane. So you may hear either coronal or frontal. Coronal referring to the crown region. And on the image coming up, you can kind of see where the crown region is dividing. The transverse plane, again, it's a horizontal plane dividing into a superior and inferior top and a bottom portion. And this is also referred to as a cross-sectional plane. Again, here's the correct sagittal plane, dividing the body into left and right parts. And the mid-sagittal plane is a vertical plane dividing it into perfectly equal left and right halves. So there's only one mid-sagittal, but there are many different sagittal planes. So here's the image in the textbook that's kind of showing us some of these, demonstrating some of these positions. The coronal plane here, front and back, an anterior and a posterior portion. Excuse me. The transverse plane, chopping somebody into a superior and inferior portion. Here is a sagittal plane. You notice it's not right down the middle, but we can chop somebody all kinds of places to make a left and a right, but it doesn't have to be right down the middle every time. So if we chop them anywhere that's not right down the middle and make a left and a right portion, then it's called the sagittal plane. If we chop them directly down the middle and we create perfect left and right halves, then that's when we have the mid-sagittal plane. So there's only one mid-sagittal, but there are many different sagittal planes on each side that you could chop somebody into. Okay, here's another view that kind of demonstrates this. Here's our friend in the Speedo. And so what we notice here is that coronal or frontal plane, kind of chopping him into front and back. Here is the transverse plane, chopping him into superior and inferior. And here is a mid-sagittal plane, specifically. It's a type of sagittal, right? And so it goes right down the middle, chopping into perfect left and right halves. So here's kind of an example of a question I might pop up on the test. Which plane would divide the body into equal left and right halves? Well, that would be mid-sagittal, right? So be ready for some kind of question like that. Which plane would divide the body into blank, top and bottom? Well, that would be a transverse plane, into left and right. If it doesn't say equal, well, then that's sagittal, right? Or front and back, well, then that would be coronal or frontal. Okay, so be prepared for some questions like that. Next, let's talk about directional terms. Again, there's some great images, and here I'm going to just fast forward real quick. Here's a couple great images, and then there's a nice little chart that's in our textbook, table 1.2. I do believe it's still the number. It may be different. I think these are a little bit older images. But these are telling us all of these terms that we need to be familiar with. Now, I want you to notice this as we go down through this list. I do not want you to pay attention to cranial versus caudal, and I don't want you to worry about the term rostral. Okay, and so you can mark those three out, and all of the rest of these you need to be familiar with. So let's go back. Let's look at these. These aren't that difficult, but let's talk about them, and then I'll again give you an example of a style of question that we might see on the test. First off, anterior and posterior. Obviously, this means towards the front, and this means toward back. Okay, so anterior is towards the front, and posterior is towards the back. Another term for anterior is ventral. So towards the belly is the vent, and so ventral is also anterior, and towards the back is also called dorsal, which is posterior. So you can use these words interchangeably, in my opinion: anterior and ventral, and posterior and dorsal. Okay, now superior towards the top, inferior towards the bottom. Okay, so let's start using these words. Where is your nose compared to your toes? Your nose is superior to your toes, right? But if we flipped it and I said, where are your toes compared to your nose? Well, the toes are inferior to the nose. Okay, so we could do that too. Where is the nose compared to your buttocks? Well, the nose would be anterior, or it would be ventral. Okay, if we switched it, where is the buttocks compared to your nose? Well, that is posterior or dorsal. Okay, so be ready for that. I will give you two different structures in the body, and you have to tell me how is the first one directionally related to the second one. Okay, and I'll give you some more examples before we leave this. Medial is towards the midline, towards your nose, towards your navel, towards your groin. So this is a midline, that mid-sagittal line. If it's closer to that, it's called medial. If it's farther away from that, it's referred to as lateral. So here, if I asked you, where is your eye compared to your ear? Well, your eye is closer to that midline, and so your eye is medial to your ear. But if I asked you opposite, where is your ear compared to your eye? Well, your ear is farther away from that midline, so your ear is lateral to the eye. Okay? Now, deep versus superficial. This is not too tough. Deep is more internal and superficial is more external. So if I ask you, where is your heart compared to your skin? Well, your heart is deep to the skin, but if we flipped it, where's your skin compared to your heart? Your skin is superficial compared to the heart. Okay, now these two are kind of tricky, so only use these if you are comparing two things, on two parts on the same structure, really. Okay, so for example, for this test, I'm only going to use arms and legs to make it easy. So proximal means closer to the beginning, and distal means towards the end. So the beginning of your leg is where it attaches at your hip, and the end of your leg is the tip of your toes. So if I ask you, where is your knee compared to your ankle? Your knee is proximal to your ankle, but if we flipped it, your ankle is distal to the knee. And so we need to be able to do this both ways to kind of understand. Proximal means closer to the beginning, and distal means closer to the end. On this test, don't use these terms unless you're comparing two things on the same limb. If I ask you, where is your elbow compared to your knee? Well, they're not on the same limb. You can't do proximal and distal. Elbow compared to knee, well, that would be superior, right? And so with many of these, also, there could be more than one correct answer. So make sure on a test that you're only giving me that one answer that you know is absolutely correct. Okay? Sorry about that. Had to sneeze. Now, again, here's some images in the book that help us to understand this. So you can take a look in the textbook and find this image. And then this table also has a lot of good information, the meaning, and another example. So if you're needing some help, here's a good example. Which directional term would most appropriately fill in the sentence? The elbow is blank to the wrist. The elbow is proximal to the wrist. But here's a good example. If I'm standing in anatomic position, again, which is what I'm comparing all these things in, the elbow is also superior to the wrist. So this one would have two answers. On the test, I only want one answer that you know is correct. If you ever give me anything that's wrong, I have to count off for it. And so I'd rather not count off if I don't have to. Let's move on. We're about to hit some regional and superficial anatomy. And so whenever we look at this, I want to mention that the body is divided into two main portions. The two main portions are the axial portion or axial region and the appendicular region. An easy way to remember this, first off, is just the word appendicular refers to your appendages, right? So your arms and your legs. The axial is what rotates around the middle, around the axis. So this is your head and your neck and your trunk, your torso, okay? So axial is kind of in the center of your body, and appendicular is what's hanging off, all right? So we will talk about this a good bit as we get in, especially to bones and muscles. Now, here is superficial anatomy. This is something that you need to be very familiar with. All of these terms on this individual are fair game to be on the test. These are all pointing out to surfaces of the skin, not regions deeper necessarily. We can use that, but this is specifically talking about these regions of the outside of the body. But many times we use these, interchangeably. Now, when we look at this, we notice that nasal, nose, oral, mouth, cervical, neck. If you start to see the pattern, they list it in Latin and they give you the English. For this test, this is going to kind of be like a foreign language test, okay? For this section, I'm going to give you some Latin and you have to tell me the English term for it, okay? And I'm not going to have this individual standing up here probably. I'm just going to have these words out here, and it'll just say nasal equals blank, and you got to put in nose. Oral equals blank, and you got to put in mouth. Okay? Now, I'm also going to have it backwards. I'm going to give you some English, and you have to give me the Latin. So I may say neck, and you have to give me cervical. Or I may say chin, and you have to give me mental. So you need to study all of these on the anterior side of this gentleman and all of these on the posterior side of this gentleman, okay? And be prepared to go either way with these, from Latin to English or English to Latin. These are also listed on a table in our Chapter 1, and so you can see all these terms and it kind of gives a brief description, almost the English interpretation. So here's an example. The term antebrachial refers to which body region? And the correct answer is forearm. So I would just list antebrachial and you would write forearm. Or I may just write thigh, which term refers to the thigh region. And then if I wrote thigh equals blank, you would fill in the blank with femoral. Okay, so be familiar. Again, kind of treat it like a foreign language test, and we're going to convert Latin to English and then English back to Latin. Now, to start to wrap this up a little bit and kind of hit the main topics that we've got, let's look at some of these body cavities and also the membranes that line these body cavities. So first off, we divide the body into two major areas, the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. This textbook likes to refer to the dorsal body cavity as the posterior aspect. I'm going to continue to call it the dorsal body cavity because that's what everybody else in anatomy and physiology calls it. Okay, so the dorsal cavity, also what they call the posterior aspect, towards the back. And if we take a look, I would like for you to go ahead, and I'm going to switch through some of this. Sorry, you're seeing stuff that you don't need yet. But here's a great image, right? So we need to look at this image real quick. Here's the dorsal body cavity towards the back. It includes the cranial cavity and then the spinal cavity or the vertebral canal. And so towards the back, we have where the central nervous system is housed. Towards the front, we have the ventral body cavity. And we're about to see that the ventral body cavity is divided into the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity, which is divided by the diaphragm. When we look closer at the thoracic and the abdominopelvic, we can further divide those cavities as well. So let's go back to our slide and let's kind of dive into this and talk about it. So here we were. Looking at the dorsal cavity. So again, this is towards the back. Hopefully you've got your textbook open. You can see that image. And so this contains the cranial cavity, which contains the brain, obviously. And it also contains the spinal cavity, or what's also called the vertebral canal, the inside of the vertebrae where the spinal cord runs. And so the spinal cavity contains the spinal cord. I like to simplify it. Dorsal cavity contains the cranial cavity with the brain and the spinal cavity with the spinal cord. Make sure that you put spinal cord on the test if I ask you what organ is in there, because if you put spine, that's not right. The spine are the bones. The spinal cord is the nervous tissue that's inside of it. Now, surrounding the brain and the spinal cord, inside of this dorsal body cavity, outside of the brain and the spinal cord, we have these layers. We have these linings. These are called meninges. If you know the term itis, the suffix itis means inflammation. Now you know what meningitis actually means. Meningitis is an inflammation of these linings. And you know that that could be deadly because it can compress on the brain, and that can cause the brain to stop working. Just like when you sit on your leg, you start to lose feeling in your foot. Same kind of concept. And so we don't want to compress the brain, and meningitis can do that, and that's definitely not good, along with other infections that can cause damage to the brain. So meninges, there are three meninges, or three of these meninges. The outer layer is called the dura mater. The middle layer is called the arachnoid, or the arachnoid mater. Either way, sometimes you see this word, sometimes you don't. Okay, so be ready for either arachnoid or arachnoid mater. It's fine either way. That's the middle layer. Looks like a spider web. It's kind of spongy and provides protection. And then the inner layer that's actually touching the actual spinal cord or the brain is called the pia mater. Okay, so be ready on the test. I'm going to ask you questions dealing with cavities. The first question is going to be a style of question where you have to tell me which cavities are inside of another cavity. Okay, so again, the first type of question, which cavity is inside of another cavity? So here, a good example. Tell me the two cavities inside of the dorsal cavity. So the two cavities inside would be the cranial and the spinal. Okay. Now the second type of question I might ask you, tell me the name of a cavity inside of another cavity, and also tell me what organ is in that cavity. So here I may say, tell me one cavity inside of the dorsal body cavity, and tell me what organ is in there. So you could tell me either cranial cavity with the brain or spinal cavity with the spinal cord. Okay. And then the third style of question is going to be dealing with linings. So here I may say, what is the middle lining of the dorsal body cavity? And that answer would be the arachnoid or the arachnoid mater. I'd take either one on the test. Okay, so be ready for those three styles of questions. Either which cavities are within the other cavity. Number two, name one cavity and an organ inside of it. Or number three, a lining question. What is the outer, inner, middle lining? Or whenever we get to these visceral and parietals, I will do them a little bit differently for these other areas. Now, let's go over here to the ventral body cavity, and let's talk about that, and then you'll see what I'm talking about with this visceral and parietal and how it's different from the dorsal body cavity. So the ventral body cavity, again, ventral means towards the front, and so this is the main area that we think about as being a body cavity. We have the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity, and these cavities are separated again by the diaphragm. Again, it mentioned here, that these are lined with serous membranes. So we'll talk about that. Kind of like these meninges that we just talked about, there's slightly different linings in the ventral body cavity. The dorsal cavity evolved a little bit differently than the ventral cavity. It even uses different fluid back there. It uses cerebrospinal fluid, not blood. And so that's one reason that we have this separation. When we're looking at these membranes, we're going to talk about a visceral layer and a parietal layer. So the visceral layer is the layer that's on the surface of the organ. Write that down. Visceral equals surface of organ. Parietal layer is on the inside of the cavity, inside of the body wall, inside of that cavity. So whenever we look at it this way, let's look at this image right here, and it might help us. Here we see this fist pushing into a balloon. What we've got is this outer layer of the balloon, and then we've got an inner layer of balloon surrounding the fist. If this fist is going to be our heart, Then what surrounds the heart is a layer right on the surface. This is going to be like the visceral layer. And then there's a layer that's on the inside of the cavity that contains the heart. And it's just lining. It's like paint on the walls of the inside of that cavity. And this is kind of like the parietal surface. Okay. Now, this is not the easiest topic to understand. So these two things, the visceral and parietal, is something you're going to have to spend some time looking at. All right. Now, these are referred to as serous cavities. I don't care about that for the test, but there is a liquid in between there, serous fluid. It acts as a lubricant, but it also kind of keeps those cavities inflated. Once we get to respiratory, we'll definitely talk about that process. Now, again, let's move on. Here was our dorsal body cavity, again with cranial and spinal cavities. Here's our thoracic, here's our abdominal pelvic, and there's that diaphragm. When we look closer, we're going to kind of get in here and we're going to see that in the thoracic cavity, we have 3 cavities, but we also have a space. So we really have these 2 major cavities, the 2 pleural cavities, and these pleural cavities are what contain the lungs. So pleural with an E, not like singular versus plural in English. So there's an E here, so it's a little bit different spelled, but pleural refers to lung. So the pleural cavity, left pleural cavity contains the left lung, right pleural cavity contains the right lung. In between these 2 cavities, we have a space, and this space is called the mediastinum or the mediastinum space. And this is simply just a big space that things like the esophagus and the trachea and some of the bronchi and the aorta and some of the blood vessels, the superior vena cava, they're going to be housed in this space. But also in this space, we have another cavity, and that cavity is the pericardial cavity. So here is the cavity that contains the heart. Peri around cardia, the heart. So here is the pericardial cavity. So there's really only 3 cavities inside of here, the 2 pleurals and the 1 pericardial. But there's also this space. So there's a little extra space because it's not just these 3 organs up here. We've got a lot of tubes that we've got to send down into the abdominal pelvic region or down further into these areas. Now, once we get into the abdominal pelvic region, that's a little bit simpler. We've got abdominal region above the hips, above the pelvis, and down into the pelvis, we have the pelvic cavity. Okay, so the pelvic cavity, if you're asked what's an organ down here, you can list one of the reproductive organs. So you could list the uterus, that's a perfect one. You could also list the bladder, right? So those are 2 great examples of organs down here in the pelvic cavity. Obviously, the penis is external, so we can't list that. It's not inside, so it's not in the cavity. We have to list something that's in the cavity. And so we could even see right over here, this is outside of that cavity. So we need to list, for example, the uterus, and or the bladder. Those are 2 great examples of organs down here. In the abdominal cavity, you can choose just about any digestive organ. So you can choose stomach, small intestines, large intestines. You could talk about the liver, the pancreas. So all of those things are in this abdominal region. So you could, abdominal cavity, so you could just list just about any digestive organ. So again, here's a little bit of a talking about these things that I just mentioned. The mediastinum or mediastinum, this is the space between the pleural cavities. And here we're going to have the heart, we're going to have the thymus, again, the esophagus, the trachea, the aorta, the superior vena cava. So we're going to have a lot of blood vessels up there. So this is a space, okay? It's not a cavity, it's just a space, an open space. In the mediastinum, we did have that pericardial cavity. So we had the pericardial cavity that contained the heart. The lining on the surface of the heart is the visceral pericardium, and the lining on the heart cavity is the parietal pericardium. Okay, so again, that's how we're going to do this. Surface of organ, lining of cavity, visceral versus parietal. Okay. Now, the pleura, again, the pleural cavities contain the lungs. The lining on the surface of the lungs are the visceral pleura. The lining on the lung cavity is the parietal pleura. All right, so be ready for that. Visceral equals on surface of organ, parietal equals lining of cavity. So here we can kind of see that. We can kind of see how these two linings kind of match up. The darker blues are the 2 linings. Here's the visceral layer. There's the parietal layer of the pericardium. Here's the visceral pleura, and there's the parietal pleura. Okay. Now, when we get down to the abdominopelvic region, we divide it into the abdominal cavity, again, dealing with digestion, or you could list kidneys or, something of that nature. And then the pelvic cavity, again, kind of the bladder and internal reproductive organs. So you could list, again, something like the uterus, or in the male, if you knew some of these organs, like the prostate gland or something like that, you could list that as well, okay? Now, in the abdominal region, the abdominopelvic cavity, there is a lining called the peritoneal lining. And sometimes it's referred to as the peritoneal cavity inside of there. And so the peritoneal is a term dealing with the abdominal region, especially the abdominopelvic region. And so the peritoneal cavity has the visceral peritoneum, which is on the lining on the surface of a digestive organ, and the parietal peritoneum, which is the lining of the digestive organ cavity. Okay, the lining of the cavity for the digestive organs. So surface of organ or lining of cavity. Again, that's the difference between the visceral and parietal. Here's an image of that, kind of showing you how touching all the organs, we've got one lining. And then we also have kind of an outer lining. Okay. Now, here's a little quiz. Which body cavity is associated with the lungs? Well, that's the pleural cavity. What are the names of the serous membranes? Well, the parietal pleura is the outer, and the visceral pleura is the inner. Now, the last thing, and we are going to have, a few of these, and this is really what I've got mainly listed in my lab manual, are these body structures. And basically, these are just the organs of the body. Now, I want you to make sure that you are following through with your lab manual, okay? Any organ listed in the lab manual that's shown on these pictures, are fair game for the test, okay? You don't have to know what these organs do. You just have to know what these organs are, okay? So here it says be able to identify any of the organs listed in your lab manual on page 3 or 4. For me, it's page 3 and page 4. It may be different for you, but just look for body structures and point it out on the images of the model in the lab images book. So use your lab images book and find that model. Here's an older view. This one's a little bit older than the image that you have, but here you can see all these different labels. So you can use this to study. If you'd like, here's the thyroid cartilage, the thyroid gland, the trachea is coming down below it. We can see the lungs, the heart, the aorta. We can see the liver and the gallbladder, the stomach. We can see the small intestines and the large intestines. We can even kind of see the spleen hiding out over here. Here's details of the stomach. Here's a little bit more about the liver. Here's details of the large intestines. Okay, so I want you to review these. Here's another view showing more internal. So again, these are two of the main views that we have in our lab manual, or a similar image to this. So I want you to take any of those that are listed, any of those organs listed in our lab manual, and make sure that you know them from those images and that you could label those, okay? You're going to have a handful, up to 10 of these or so on the test, and you've got to tell me the name of that organ. All right. Again, spelling's important. So practice spelling. Maybe even print up some copies of your lab manual and cover up these words, and then practice seeing if you fill them in and make sure that you're spelling them correctly. And that'll be some really good practice for this test. All right. At that point, we're finished with this first lab for A&P. Congratulations. First lab done. This lab has got a real hodgepodge of information. So we didn't focus on one single system, which is what we're going to kind of do from here on out almost, okay? Our next lab is going to be dealing with tissues, and then our final lab before our first lab test is going to deal with the integumentary system. So again, these first two labs, this one and the next one dealing with tissues, are kind of a little extra information, okay? But then we're going to get on track and we're going to start focusing on specific systems, and it's going to become a little bit easier to know what to study and how to study for a test. All right. First tests are always a little anxious, so please realize that that's normal. If you're feeling anxiety about this, then you're just a normal human. So don't get upset. The only thing that you can do is work hard towards studying. So do this recording again if you'd like. Bring your questions into class. I will cover these things in class as well. And so that way, we're all on the same page and you don't have that anxiety anymore. All right. So the key to getting rid of that anxiety is studying and working hard. And so start studying, start working hard on this stuff, and you'll start to feel more comfortable with it. And then you'll see that anxiety is going to disappear and you'll start to feel very comfortable. And once you get on that test, you're going to be just as comfortable and you're going to do very well. All right. I hope everybody has a great day. Make sure that you're studying and you're taking care of any other assignments that we have online. All right. Have a good day.